Morning, everybody. Okay. It really is a pleasure to introduce Chris Enss. You will see why shortly. So, she is a New York Times best-selling author. She has written over 50 books in 30 years. And she has received several awards for her books, films, research. For example, 9 Will Rogers Medallion Awards. So, and some of the writing is also for scholarly nonfiction. And the topics of her books and films span a very wide range. For example, in titles, A Beautiful Mind on Women Prospectors, Hearts West, True Stories of Mail-Order Brides on the Frontier. What a difference, eh, in topics. Happy Trails, about Dale Evans and Roy Rogers, and Pistol Packin' Madams, about bordellos. Okay. And one thing that stands out for me is that through her research, she has found that the role women actually played in taming the West, or the Old West as we say, is still misunderstood. They were not just supporting characters, but doctors, railway waitresses, registered nurses, heroic frontier teachers, and outlaws like Belle Starr, who was with Jesse James, actresses, and women of the night. And by the way, in the parking lot of the National Hotel is a plaque to Women of the Night. I think it's still there. I saw it a few years ago. So let's listen to Chris bring to life so many interesting stories about clever, determined, and daring women who have contributed to the development of the American frontier.
Thank you, Carolyn, and thank you so much to Bernadette. Where's Bernadette? She's wonderful. She is just fantastic. I really appreciated her always calling, saying, all right, here's where we're gonna be, here's the time. She was very good at that, and I appreciate it. A lot of times you don't get that, so thank you, Bernadette. And thank you all for inviting me to come today, and I really appreciate the opportunity to come and speak about women of the American frontier. I've been writing for 3 decades, more than 3 decades now on this subject. And I wanted to write about it because most people think when they talk about women of the American frontier, they fall into 2 categories. They're either Miss Kitty from Dodge City or Laura Ingalls from Little House on the Prairie. We don't think that women did much in between that, but indeed, women were so well-rounded and they really put their mark on the American frontier. And that's because west of the Mississippi, there were really no rules. And they were hoping to populate this portion of the country. And so women could come here and really make their mark and not ask anybody's permission, or no one said you can't do that because you're a woman. It didn't make any difference. We need to have people out here. And so these women really did do great things. I have spent a great deal of time, it seems like, and it wasn't on purpose, but I've written a lot about prostitution of the American West. I've written about it so much that in Deadwood, South Dakota, they refer to me as a whorestorian. So, but I want to let you know that that was, of course, one of the 2 very first professions in the American West. These business women would follow the miners, they would follow the military units, and they would set up shop in towns. And I wrote a book called An Open Secret, that's up here, and it's about the history of prostitution in Deadwood, South Dakota, because it started there in 1876, and it wasn't outlawed until 1980. So almost more than 103 years of legalized prostitution. And I wrote about that there because there's every place else said you have to get rid of this. I think a lot of other communities would not have gotten rid of it so quickly. But the prostitutes and the women who ran the bordellos, they really did help build communities. We don't like to think of it because it's such a dastardly profession. And certainly if you lived beyond the age of 25 and you were in that profession, you were lucky because most women didn't live beyond that age in that profession. But the women who owned the bordellos, they had to pay a license to be able to operate those bordellos. And when they got fined, that went back into the community. And these women also contributed to the community in so much in helping to build libraries and helping to build wings onto hospitals and other items for schools. They were very involved in that kind of thing. And especially in Deadwood, South Dakota, that was a real tourist. I mean, they had, and you'll come up here when you take a look at the book, they had a whole area called the Badlands where all the brothels were. And they were known, they had names like The Office. And that's because if you were a man who wanted to go visit the prostitution homes, you could just tell your wife, I'll be at the office. And they would have no idea. But prostitution on the American frontier was a necessary evil. And part of it was because they believed if they allowed that women would not be molested by anyone. They would not be accosted. Also, women, pioneer women, believed that they had to abstain from sex until their children were weaned. And sometimes they were 2 years old and higher. And so during that time period, they would just send their husbands into town. Please get away from me. I'm not interested. Go to town. So one of the other books that I bring up the whole thing about prostitution, not because I'm just so crazy about that profession, but just to let you know that in 1872, when Susan B. Anthony was making her trek through the West, talking about women's suffrage, she pointed to the prostitutes, because if you ran a bordello, you could vote in local elections. So Susan B. Anthony was able to say, we can vote and we can vote responsibly, and let me point to these women who have been doing that. Again, it's not, I wouldn't say, hey, thank a prostitute. But, we do have those early women to be able to thank for the 19th Amendment being able to eventually be pushed forward in August of 1920. And so I wrote this book called No Place for a Woman: The Struggle for Suffrage in the Wild West. Because the suffrage movement started east of the Hudson, but it wasn't realized until it was west of the Mississippi. And there's a great saying at that particular time in the 1880s. It was, first the West, then the rest of the country. Because one of the very first states it was actually a territory to allow women to vote. There were two. One was Wyoming and the other one was Utah. They encouraged women to come to Wyoming because they wanted statehood. And they would tell women, come and settle here, we're going to give you the right to vote. Women in Wyoming were given the right to vote in November of 1869. But women in Utah were given the right to vote in February of 1869. Women voted in Wyoming. It's always noted that the women in Wyoming, Louisa Swain was the first woman to vote in Wyoming. She was a grandmother on her way into town to get some sourdough fixins, and she stopped to be able to vote. But really, the women in Utah had voted first. And I will tell you why we recognize Wyoming over Utah. And that's because they gave women the right to vote in Utah, thinking that they were going to vote out pluralistic marriage. When women didn't do that, they took their right to vote back. So women had to fight for that twice. And so I just think when I was writing the book, people were very upset about the fact that I would even mention Wyoming being the first, because Utah was the first. But that's the reason why. I had to tell them, I didn't make up history. It just is. I'm just reporting. I'm just the weatherman. This is just the way it is. But people in Utah were pretty upset about that. So that's why, when you see in the book, that's the reason why. The 19th Amendment has great significance here in Nevada County, because it was here in Nevada County that the 19th Amendment was written. And that was in the early 1870s. And it was written by Ellen Clark Sargent, who was married to Senator Aaron Sargent. And she was very much into the suffrage movement, and Aaron was very much in support of her. And so she drafts the 19th Amendment, and they're tinkering with it, and they get on a train that's going to take them from California to Washington, D.C., where the senator has to go to work. And they have to change trains in Wyoming. And it is snowing like crazy, and the train is really packed. But getting on this particular train in 1872 in Wyoming is a woman that Ellen Clark Sargent recognizes right off as Susan B. Anthony, who is not going to have any place to sit. And so the Sargents invite her to come in and share their berth with them and their pantry of food. And so from Wyoming to Chicago, they iron out the official wording of the 19th Amendment. The wording stays exactly the same until August 1920, when the 19th Amendment is officially ratified. And it happened right here in this county, the initial drafting of it. And I think that that's amazing, that we have some of the great history that we do here, and it needs just to be embraced. It's like, I didn't know that they had a plaque for the women of the night behind the Holbrook. That's wonderful. That's very good. Who's off of them? One of the things I was sharing at the very beginning with some of the ladies who were probably thinking, please go away from me. I want to hear this later from you, not now. But anyway, I was sharing with them that the whole idea of prostitutes in these colored taffeta dresses, because a lot of times when you watch movies, that's what it is, multicolored taffeta dresses and the black tights, and they just look stunning. That really started in the 1960s with Technicolor television, because women of the night did not dress like that. Women wore these, first of all, how are you going to clean multicolored taffeta in the West? There are no dry cleaners. But they wanted that color to pop on television, and so that's the reason why you always see that. But really, prostitutes wore these big, blousy nightgowns. And they wore these big, blousy nightgowns because the whole idea of their profession was to have as many clients taken care of during the course of the day and evening as they possibly could. So it was important that you be able to maximize your time. If you had to take off corsets, unlace boots, and this is being recorded, so how proud am I that people can watch this later in their homes if you want to know more about prostitution. But if it just was time consuming to do all of that. And these women, their idea was, okay, we're here to make a living, how are we going to be able to maximize our time? So not only did they have these big blousy nightgowns that they wore, but they also figured out that if they put a drop cloth on the end of their beds, that they could preserve their bedding by allowing the miners or the cowboys to not take off their boots. I know what you're thinking. And so what I find amazing about that is, whenever you read a Martha Stewart magazine, and you see this wonderful picture of a bedroom with the drop cloth at the bottom of the bed, please know that was right out of a whorehouse. And you got to ask yourself, what is Martha doing? But so much of what we do today is a holdover from, decades ago. And that's just one of them. And that's why I said wayward women, and the wayward women and how they helped settle the West, because these wayward women were the first, and because they were the first, they were able to be the first to vote. And so it's really essential that we know that. Now, I was talking with some group, I can't remember what group of women it was, but they asked me if I ever thought about going to a prostitutes convention and sharing these stories. I don't think that prostitutes have conventions. And if they did, I don't want to go. And so they asked me if I knew where some prostitutes were so I could go and thank them. I can just imagine me explaining that to any law enforcement agent. Anyway, I just was very amazed at these first women, and that's going to lead me to this other book that I wrote called Iron Women, Women Who Helped Build the Railroad. Because, so much happened on a railroad with women in history. If you come up and take a look at the book, you'll see some of the pictures inside the book of when the Transcontinental Railroad met up at Promontory Summit in 1869. And you will see in those pictures, the only women that are photographed are the women that were married to the railroad tycoons. They believed it wasn't good to be able to put women in the pictures because women had no hand in surveying any of the land or laying any of the track. And so they said they don't need to be photographed during this momentous occasion and kick them out. But had it not been for women, no one would have gotten on the trains at all to ride, because men didn't care anything about comfort. They didn't care anything about the environment. It was women who invented the emissions control systems that went on those steam engines that was belching the black smoke out across the prairies. It was women who said, let's put a bathroom on these trains. It was a woman who invented incandescent lighting for the trains. It was a woman who invented the cattle car. It was a woman who invented the modern-day refrigerator boxcar. It was a woman who invented this particular mechanism that goes in the wheel wells of the wheels that stop a train. It was a woman who invented that to be able to stop a train adequately. It was a woman who invented the crossing guard. It was a woman who did more to promote train travel in the 19th century than any other man. And her name was Miriam Leslie. Now, Miriam Leslie was married to a gentleman by the name of Frank Leslie. I don't know if any of you go to antique stores and ever see Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, but that was a very popular newspaper in the Old West. And the Leslies had lots of money. They lived in New York. They had lots of friends that were railroad tycoons. And by 1874, the railroad tycoons would all get together and they would share with Frank Leslie how desperate the situation was with train travel because nobody was getting on the trains. They couldn't figure out what they were going to do. And Miriam Leslie said, you know what, I've got an idea. I'm going to pull together 12 of the finest artists and poets and songwriters, and we are going to, and storytellers, and we're going to take a trip from New York to San Francisco and back again, and we're going to make all these stops in between, and we're going to stop and we're going to write about what we see. And that's what she did. She had special train cars made up where the people slept, where they had their dinner, and they would stop at these phenomenal places, some of them right here in California. And when it took 5 months to get from New York to San Francisco and back again, and when they got there, Miriam Leslie writes a book called From Gotham to the Golden Gate and Back Again. And everybody buys this book. It becomes the foremost tourist book in the nation. People buy the book and they get on the trains and they ride the trains. They ride the rails. Miriam Leslie was just phenomenal. Her husband dies not too long after that book becomes very, very popular. And she's so tired of people saying to her, aren't you Frank Leslie's wife? She takes over the magazine and really finally the magazine starts to make money. And she gets so tired of people saying, aren't you Frank Leslie's wife, that she changes her name to Frank. No more Miriam. So now when you talk about Frank Leslie's paper, that's my paper. I don't belong to anybody, that's my paper. But there are amazing stories about all the things that women did, including how the 19th Amendment is finalized and really reworked on the train. And it's the story of Ellen and Susan B. Anthony. So I'm just amazed because you don't know that women did this with railroads. I mean, no one really talks about this. Maybe it's because not a lot of people take the train anymore. But even if they did, who would know about that? But these women were just amazing. And so that book is all about that particular venture. Now, I wrote another book here called The Pinks. And The Pinks is about the first female Pinkerton detectives in the Old West. And I bring this up, not just because I loved writing about it, but because, again, it has another train component. The very first detective with the Pinkerton Detective Agency is a woman by the name of Kate Warren, who walked into Alan Pinkerton's office in Chicago in 1856 and says, I would like to work here. And Pinkerton says, well, we're not hiring any secretaries, I'm sorry. She said, no. I want to be an agent. I think I could be a good agent and get into places that men can't. And so he takes a chance and he does hire her. Now, I want to do a sidebar here and let you know that there were many men in the West. Chicago's not necessarily West, but he did run everything, all the Pinkerton agencies in the West. But there were men that were quite progressive. You'll find a lot of them in the suffrage book that I wrote. They were called suffragents, men who believed that women should have the vote, and they petitioned for women to have the vote. And then there were men like Alan Pinkerton who said, we're going to hire women. And he hires Kate Warren, and he pays her compensatory to what the other men are making. The other person that did that in the West was Buffalo Bill Cody. Cody was quite the womanizer, so there's probably a reason why he paid them more than men, but he did. But Kate was a phenomenal lady. So this was in 1856. And it was the summer of 1856 that she gets hired. And the first case that Alan Pinkerton sends her on is a murder that has taken place in Mississippi. There has been a bank teller that has been murdered. The back of his head has been bashed in. The crime scene is quite bloody. On the floor is a monogrammed button with the initials AD. And in the potbelly stove is a half-burned up IOU signed Alexander Drysdale. So it doesn't really take a Pinkerton agent to figure out that the person that murdered the teller is Alexander Drysdale. But the Pinkertons, they don't care anything about the murder. They don't care about arrests. The Pinkertons' job then and now is recovery. We just want our money back. If you did it, set somebody else to work out, just give us our money back. Drysdale took more than $50,000 from the bank over a period of time. The teller found out. He murdered the teller. So Kate goes into Mississippi, and she takes 2 male agents with her. And she decides that the best way that I'm going to be able to figure out where this money is if I befriend Drysdale's wife. So the two of them spend a lot of time together. They go to lunch together. They have teas together. They go to sewing bees together. They go horseback riding together. And after a few weeks, Kate decides, here's what I'm going to do. We're going to go on a horseback ride, and I am going to fall off my horse in front of their plantation and pretend to be more hurt than I really am. And then they'll take me into their home. And that's indeed what happened. They felt terrible. This happened on our property. How could we allow this? Please come in and convalesce here. So that's exactly what Kate wanted. She wanted into that house. And here is when the deviousness of Kate comes about. What she starts to do is she sneaks into Drysdale's room, because man and wife, they weren't sleeping in the same room, which, I've been married for almost 40 years, and I think that's a golden idea. I love my husband, but there are times I just want to go, you have to leave. I think of him like an employer. We're going to have to make some changes. This is just how it's going to have to be. And it's because of the snoring. So I bet they had that same snoring thing. So the Drysdales didn't sleep in the same room. Kate would sneak into Alexander Drysdale's room, and she started leaving a little trail of blood next to his bed. Now, Drysdale gets up and he thinks, wow, I had a nosebleed. I didn't know I had a nosebleed. But as the weeks go on, that trail of blood leads further and further out of the bedroom, out down the hallway, down the stairs, and finally, one bright moonlit night, that trail of blood leads all the way to the garden. He follows it. Now, this is happening she's gaslighting the guy, so he doesn't know what is going on. He's freaking out. But on this particular moonlit night, he goes out to follow this trail of blood, and he looks up through a clearing in the trees, and he sees, but he doesn't know, is one of those male Pinkerton agents dressed like the teller that he murdered, with his head all bashed in. Now he's freaking out. Kate's watching him. Now, in order to find out how that works, you'll have to get the book. I have 6 copies left. But Kate Warren is the first female Pinkerton detective agent. She becomes the head of what we now know is the Secret Service. And let me tell you the train story that goes with Kate, because Kate does her first case in Mississippi, and her next big case, she uncovers what is known as the Baltimore plot. And that's the plot to assassinate Lincoln before he takes the oath of office. Pinkerton charges her with going into Pennsylvania and secreting the president out on a train, which they've already got a heads up that people know you're going to be on some train. So the bad guys are going to try to derail the train. They're going to try to overtake the train. And so when he sends Kate into Pennsylvania, she does find the president, and she tells him, here's what we're going to do. I have to get you to the train. You're going to take off that stovepipe hat. You're going to leave it here. You're going to walk hunched over. I'm going to put a shawl around your shoulders. I'm dressed in black. You're in black. You're my brother who's deathly ill. I'm taking you to a doctor. So she goes, gets him on the train. Everything works out. They know the train might be overtaken. She stays with the president the entire time. She does not sleep, and she just never leaves his side. Now, what's important about the fact that she doesn't sleep is the logo for the Pinkerton Detective Agency is a woman's eye, wide open, and the motto is, the eye that never sleeps. And that's because of Kate Warren. How many knew that the first Secret Service agent and the one who went on to train all these women was a woman? But these women did amazing things, including some of them disguising themselves as prostitutes to work at the bordello when they're in San Antonio when they're trying to get Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Again, I know way too much about bordellos. But these women were quite significant. So Kate's the first. The second Pinkerton detective agent, and one that was just phenomenal, it doesn't get the press that she needs, is a woman by the name of Hattie Lawton. And Hattie Lawton was a slave, and her skin complexion was very light. And so she could secret out messages out of the South into Virginia with the people that owned her, let's say. And then when she was in Virginia, and after she's hired for Pinkerton, he assigns her to be with this other agent by the name of Tim Webster. And they pose as husband and wife in Virginia and attend all these events hosted by Southern sympathizers so they could get information about what's happening. She would get that information, and she would sew those secrets into the bottom of her skirt and then make sure they got to the right person. Just Just a phenomenal woman. But, nobody knows about Hattie either. And so that's what that book is all about. And so that's my railroad story. All these seem to have a tie-in, a connective tissue with the railroad. The next one I want to tell you about that's got a tie-in with the railroad is called The Doctor Was a Woman. It's about the first female physicians on the frontier. Oh, and this is a book for you. You can use it in your PT, what you're doing over there. I'm kidding, probably not, but I've written a lot about these first female physicians, and in addition to writing the chapters, is their medical paper. So let me explain to you one of the doctors. Two of them I wrote about. One is Dr. Sophie Herzog. Dr. Sophie Herzog was a Texas physician and the foremost authority on gunshot wound removal. In the Old West, if you were shot, if the bullet didn't kill you outright, a doctor probing in to remove it would kill you, oftentimes. So Dr. Sophie devised this way of being able to, if she got a gunshot wound victim in, and he was shot below the heart, above the knee, she would tie a rope around his legs, tie a rope around his upper torso, tie them to a pole above the hospital bed, and flip them upside down, and let them hang there for an indeterminate amount of time. Her theory was gravity will take effect, and that bullet would work its way to the surface of the wound. And she was right. She removed so many bullets that way that she had a necklace made of those bullets and a bracelet. And when she passed away, she was buried with those two things. Just a phenomenal doctor who ends up, as many of these women surgeons, because they studied medicine in the East. First of all, women were only allowed to study in the East midwifery. That was your beginning point. If you wanted to study any further than that, you were looked upon in the East, looked down upon in the East. For example, the first two women who attended Harvard in 1850 to study medicine, the men at Harvard were so upset with women who deemed themselves to be so unfeminine as to pursue this profession, decreed that a curtain had to be drawn between themselves and the women, because they said any woman who deemed themselves so unfeminine to pursue this cannot even be looked upon. This is Harvard in 1850. And so you had to be a pretty tough character if you're a woman to stick in there. So the book is a lot about what these women had to endure, and thinking when they got west that it would be a lot easier because there weren't a lot of doctors in a 75-mile range. So you could set up a practice. But oftentimes it didn't work like this because it wouldn't make any difference whether you're a man or a woman. People didn't trust doctors. You had to prove yourself with a farm animal first. So often these women were, one of the women that I write about in the book, she's one of the first doctors in the Montana area, and it's a very rural area, nobody around. And she's there with her three nieces who she inherits, she takes on to raise because her brother and sister-in-law are killed in a horrific accident. And so she's got her three nieces, and they go to Montana and they're trying to figure out how they're gonna, because she can't get any patients. And she hears a knock on the door very late at night, and she goes to it, and it's a farmer that says, "My horse is really ill, and I need your help." And she says, "I don't know anything about horses." And he said, "Let me just tell you what's wrong." And so he describes what's wrong with the horse, and she said, "Well, it sounds like he has colic. I can give you medicine for colic, but you're the one's gonna have to administer it. I don't know anything about the dosage for a horse. So I'll give you this medicine," which, by the way, women were not allowed to buy any pharmaceuticals or any medical supplies. That was frowned upon. And so these women had to become their own pharmacists. So they made up their own everything. And so this particular doctor says, I think it's Dr. Carpenter, she says, "Okay, I'm gonna give you some medicine for your horse. You're the one responsible for giving the dosage, however many tons this animal, but that's all on you. He leaves. The next afternoon, he shows up with his wagon, his wife, and his 12 children. The horse is fine. Now I can trust you with my whole family. So that's what started her profession to be as profitable as it was. Now, they didn't get paid oftentimes in currency. It was chickens or jam. It was a lot like Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman, if you ever saw that show. Only they didn't look a lot like Jane Seymour. And I will tell you, there was no Sully nearby. But a lot of these women, when they figured out that they weren't going to have a thriving practice, hired on with the railroads as railroad physicians and surgeons. Because when the men were surveying the land and laying the track, they were hurt oftentimes in so doing. They were attacked by warring Native Americans who didn't want them there. And so people like Dr. Sophie Herzog, who was with the railroad as a surgeon for 25 years, would get on one of those little handcart things that you pump. When she got a call that somebody was ill on the line, that's how she would do it. Get out. There was nobody else doing that. That was you. That was all you getting there to where you needed to be. One of the other ladies I write about in the book is Dr. Lillian Heath. And Dr. Lillian Heath is one of the very first physicians on the American frontier who takes care of plastic surgery. And it happened purely by accident. It wasn't Botox or anything like that she was interested in, facelifts or anything like that. She worked as a railroad doctor in Wyoming, in Rawlins, Wyoming, and she got a patient in one day who had taken a shotgun, put it here, wanted to kill himself, but it didn't kill him, just blew his face apart. It took her 17 surgeries to put him all back together again. His name was George Webb. And if you can just imagine, this was in the early 1890s. There's no anesthesia like what you think of today. There's none of those refinements. They had morphine, but there's none of those refinements that we know of today. They weren't being kind like they were over in this lovely lady's business over here. They were being as brutal as they could because this is what we have to do to get you better. So 17 surgeries. And I want you to come up and take a look at George Webb because you can see the stitching right down his face, right down the middle of it where she stitched him all up. Had to put his nose back together. He's so incredibly grateful because he finds a purpose to live after that. And he gets married and he has children. And he was in Lillian Heath's debt forever. Now, in addition to these ladies that I've just told you about, is their medical papers, which I mentioned. So you will be able to read Dr. Sophie's medical paper on how to remove bullets. So you yourself can remove bullets at your home. There's also a chapter in here on Dr. Lucy Hobbs, who was the first dentist in the United States, who starts in Chicago and then has her own practice in San Francisco. Her husband sees that it's such an amazing practice that he leaves his trade altogether and becomes a dentist. So you'll read her papers as well as Dr. Lillian Heath's papers in case you meet somebody whose face needs to be stitched up. Well, that's what that's all about. But the fact that these ladies did hire on to be surgeons for the railroad was significant because they weren't going to be able to have a thriving practice anywhere else but there. So it was really good that because no men wanted to do that. Men didn't want to get on the hand carts and pump them from one place to the next. But women said, I'll do that. I'm happy to do that. This book here is another book about a woman who got on a train. And this is one of I don't really like romance books, and it's not something that because they don't ever ring true. I mean, love at first sight is easy. It's when you've been looking at the person for 40 years and you still love them that it becomes a miracle. And so this is called The Lady and the Mountain Man. And all the books that I write are nonfiction. And this is a story of Isabella Bird. Anybody ever hear of Isabella Bird? Well, now you're going to. And then you can just chat up a storm with anybody that comes over and you think, I don't know what to talk to him about. You can talk to him about Isabella Bird. Isabella Bird was the daughter of a minister in England. And she had very poor health. She had back problems. She wanted to serve the Lord, though. I mean, that's all she wanted to do. She taught Bible study. She spent a lot of time in the Word. But she was too ill to be able to continue on this trajectory. And the doctors tried to help her as much as they could, but they eventually said, listen, we've done all that we can for you. The best thing that we can suggest is that you take you go on a sojourn, take a cruise, take a ship somewhere. And she had always wanted to climb Long's Peak. So in 1874, she gets on a ship and she comes to San Francisco, gets to San Francisco, takes all these different wagons to get to Colorado. Now, she's a very sickly British woman. She's so sickly and her back is in such bad shape that she has to have a wire cage around her neck to support her head. So, 1874, she arrives in Colorado, sickly woman, but very prim, proper, Victorian clothes, in an area where there are not a lot of women. And she announces that she wants to go to Long's Peak. Will someone take her? First of all, you're a woman. We're not taking any woman anywhere. Secondly, you can't even hold your head up. We're not going to do that either. Finally, she meets a gentleman by the name of Jim Nugent. Jim Nugent was a mountain man, big, over 6 feet tall, big guy. One half of his face was gorgeous, the other half not so, because he'd been in a fight with a bear, and half of it was tore off. He had one time studied to be a priest and left that profession because he was drinking way too much of the sacramental wine. So he's an alcoholic. And so he lives alone in these mountain regions of Colorado, and he tells Isabella, I'll take you. And he does. And the two of them embark in this journey to go up Long's Peak. It's a very long journey. They camp out at night. They talk about scripture. He's an incredible poet. She too loves poetry. He shares poems with her. A lot of the times, he's carrying her on his back to get up to Long's Peak. By the time they get down from Long's Peak, they're very much in love, and she no longer needs the cage around her neck. She's healed. It's the air, it's the fact that I was this unattractive spinster from England, and now someone finds me appealing. Anyway, she doesn't need this, but she realizes I cannot tie myself to Jim, even though I'm in love with him and he wants to marry me. I can't tie myself to him because he's a drunk. And what man can tie herself to someone who drinks as much as he does? And he knows he's flawed, but he loves her. And his heart is broken when she says, no, I can't. I have to go back to England and be with my sister and my father. I can't marry you because of this amazing flaw. So when they part way, it's just very sad. And she's weeping, and he's weeping, and he says to her, I'm going to find you. There'll be a day that I find you, so we'll be together. Not long after she leaves Colorado, he is shot. Now, he's such a big, burly guy that he lives 3 months after being shot. See, I mean, this is something when I was doing the research that I didn't know, that at one time England wanted that big swatch of Colorado all themselves for all their aristocrats and the royalty to come there to hunt. So they didn't want any of the American citizens there. They didn't want any low-life people there. They wanted all the aristocrats from England to have this. And so when Jim Nugent wouldn't move, they sent people to kill him. And so they shoot him. He recognizes who shoots him. He lives 3 months so he can take these people to court. Now, meanwhile, she is so upset that when she leaves, she doesn't go right back to England. She goes to Switzerland and checks herself into one of those, you would call them spas now, but they were just rehabilitation places where she could get over her depression. And she wakes up one night and she awakens with Mountain Jim at the foot of her bed. Again, I won't tell you why, you got to read the book. But what is phenomenal about Isabella Bird, she becomes the first woman to be inducted into the Royal National Geographic Society because she becomes the foremost traveler and writer of traveler in China, Pakistan, and Indonesia. She goes from being this woman who's sickly, who's told you're not going to make it, to being the foremost writer of travel in the Far East. First woman to be inducted in the Royal National Geographic Society. Anybody ever heard of this woman? And it's a very romantic story, in addition to this woman just being empowered to be able to go out and do everything that she did. I just am amazed, these gems of these women of the American West that you don't hear of, that you come across and you go, you got to tell that story. I didn't bring this particular book up here. There's some others here I'll talk to you about in a minute. But I wrote a book called The Trials of Annie Oakley. And it's not the regular story of Annie Oakley. Everybody knows Annie Oakley was a sharpshooter, and she was with Buffalo Bill Cody's show. Everybody knows that. This is the story of the 6 years of Annie Oakley, where she took William Randolph Hearst to court, suing him for defamation of character. And it took her 6 years. But a lot of people don't know that she was very early on, when she was with Cody and they were on a train, the train was involved in a head-on collision with another train, and she is knocked out of her berth and a trunk falls on her and really severely injures her back. Now, if you can imagine, back surgery in the late 1870s was nowhere near progressed as it is. But she was severely handicapped after that. You would never see her in a split skirt after that accident. And every time you see a picture of her with dark hair, that was not Annie Oakley's hair, that's a wig. Annie Oakley went gray very early on in her life, and she said it's in part because of that train accident. She said she went gray overnight, and I don't think that that's possible. I mean, that's hyperbole. But whenever you see the long, dark hair, that's a wig. Annie's hair was completely gray. And some of the pictures you see of her, she was gray. But she spent 6 years suing William Randolph Hearst because Hearst, he was a sensationalist. And in Chicago, in the late 1890s, there was a prostitute. Yes, I know, it's another prostitute story. Just bear with me. There was another prostitute that was arrested in Chicago. Her name was Annie Oakley, A-N-Y, Oakley. That's what she called herself. And she's drunk as a skunk when they take her into court for stealing men's pants and buying drugs. I don't really know how much you get for pants selling, but this was in the late 1890s, and that's what happened. And so they arrest her, and they take her to court, and when they get her into court, she's drunk. And they're yelling at her, saying, "Tell us about Buffalo Bill Cody, Annie, about your time." Well, she starts making up stuff. And so the newspaper, the next day, he owned 55 newspapers at this point in history, and all 55 of the newspapers had a headline that said, "America's sweetheart drunk, caught stealing pants, buying drugs." Well, Annie Oakley is in upstate New York, and she sends a note back saying, "That's not me. I want you to retract that." Hearst has no intention of retracting it because his papers are selling like crazy. Now, Annie spent her entire career to make sure that people knew that she could read and write, because people never thought that she could read or write. They didn't think that she was literate at all, but she was. She was a smart cookie. And she was irritated that people didn't think that, and this only solidified it in their minds. And so she spent 6 years, she's sued all 55 of those newspapers. She's won as little as a dime and as much as $1,000. But it was the principle. She won 55 of the cases. The newspaper editor of the 55th newspaper apologized, and Hearst fired him. So really, it was a win across the way. But because of Annie Oakley, we now have what we know as class action lawsuits. Hearst was furious that you would sue independently. You must sue as a corporate. So that's how that all came about. I just told you about the story, and I don't even have it for sale. But again, it's a great railroad story. I've written about frontier teachers of the American West, which is quite significant. Teachers of the American frontier, they only taught for 3 months out of the year. Your children, your family was meant to work your land, work the mines, and so your kids were really your hired hands. You couldn't be without them for 9 months out of the year. They had to be at home. So they only were in school for 3 months. And when women came to teach these children, they figured the only way to tame the West was to educate the West. And so they came out west, and they had no books, no paper, no nothing. They would take their students to cemeteries, and they would teach them their alphabet and their numbers off of the wooden crosses that were there. So whenever you come across, now there's, if you go over here, there's a wonderful picture of the teachers over at Mount St. Mary's. They too took their children to cemeteries. So whenever you see a teacher and their kids are all at a cemetery, don't think that that's morbid. That was class. And these women came to school armed, because you never knew who was going to attack the school and the students. You know, it might be something that we think about today, given everything that happens often. But anyway, these are just a few of the books that I have up here. I have some great books about mail order brides of the American frontier. A lot of people don't know that in the 1850s, there weren't a lot of marriageable women out here, and so men advertised in a magazine called Matrimonial News. And women, by 1865, started to advertise for husbands. Anybody have any idea about why 1865 they would start advertising? In the Civil War, no marriage of men. And so they would advertise. And my favorite advertisement is this woman who writes, "I'm fat, fair, and plan on losing no weight." I love her. But women would advertise specifically. What do you think women were looking for when they advertised for a husband? Who said money? Nothing's changed. That's absolutely correct. That's correct. What do you think that men were looking for when they advertised for a wife? Cook? Sex? They were looking for someone that was musically inclined. You were here in the West, you had no refinement. You missed your family home. Music hearkened you to home. It brought about a feeling that they missed, and that's what they desired. So just interesting how these people advertised and how they got married. One of the stories in the book up here is about a woman who she wants to go west to be a missionary. They won't let her go because she's not married. They team her up with this man who wants to go west, and he can't go because he's not married. So they meet, they get married. She writes in her journal, "I cannot imagine spending one day with this man." 52 years later, she writes in her journal, "I can't imagine spending one day without this man." Does anybody have any questions about women of the American frontier? Yes.
You're talking about all the prostitutes and such like that. I couldn't help but think about the movie Paint Your Wagon, which is supposed to be Nevada City. So in the movie, when they're trying to build No Name City, they actually say, we're going to go south to Sonora to get the French tarts. Okay, and they reference, and there's another hit up on Red Dog. You know, they've got a bar bill over in Yuba City and such like that. But so a lot of that history here in Nevada County is those French tarts?
Well, that's very true. I mean, you can't go around any of the roads here in town and not see, a lot of them are named for the prostitutes, you know. A lot of them are named for I have no entertainer books, I thought I did. Anyway, a lot of them are named for the first entertainer. I do? Oh, I do, it's right there. Well, we don't have any time for me. Can I tell you one entertaining story? I do, it's almost 11, and then you guys can say, that's it for this woman, I'm done with her. Or you can ask more questions. But I'll tell you one entertaining story. Prostitutes were very, very low on the moral rung. Just above them were actresses, singers, and dancers. One of the women that I write about in the book is a woman by the name of Kate Rockwell. Kate Rockwell was known as the Flame of the Yukon. She is this amazing entertainer in the Yukon area, and her act consisted of coming out on stage dressed as head to toe in red chiffon, with an umbrella with red chiffon on it, and the music would start up, and she would spin around as quickly as she possibly could, and that chiffon would all stand out, and making it look like she was on fire, which is why they called her the Flame of the Yukon. But if you saw that once, there was no reason to go back to see it again, because that was it. That was the entire act. But there weren't a lot of channels to choose from in the Old West, so that was, you would go and see that. So Kate Rockwell is very, very famous. She marries a bartender, and the bartender decides he's going to send her to a variety of places throughout the United States to be able to perform. So she goes as far south as Texas, as far east as St. Louis, and she's a big hit. And she sends her money back to her husband, who after a while decides he's going to have an affair with a young chippy. And he sends this young chippy to be trained by Kate to do the act. I don't know what training you need, but he did. He sent her, and Kate trained this woman. The woman went back. Kate goes back to the Yukon, and her husband divorces her. Throughout the course of this time, though, he is buying up Nickelodeons. And he's buying all these theaters across the nation. She dies a pauper. He is Alexander Pantages of the Pantages Theaters. Every dime that was used to purchase those Pantages Theaters were made by Kate Rockwell. But you don't know anything about Kate Rockwell. So the next time you're in Los Angeles or wherever you see a Pantages Theater, please spit and say, "Huzzah for Kate," because that's who made that possible. I don't even know. I just wanted to tell my Kate story because she needs to be champion. Anybody else have any questions?
Any more questions?
Right here.
How did you even begin your path, your journey here? What piqued your interest to start exploring, and where did you start?
Well, I moved here 30 plus years ago, and I didn't know anybody, and so I went down to KNCO to start working there. And I think the minute you move to this county, you have to register to vote and then write down when you can work at KNCO. Because I think everybody has worked at KNCO at one time or another. And so I started working there and started doing history minutes. And I happened onto these amazing stories about the women right here that I think needed to be amplified. And so I wrote a book called With Great Hope, Women of the California Gold Rush. And so it started from there. But this was not what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a stand-up comic. But comedy is very subjective, and after traveling around for a while during different nightclubs, I thought, I don't want to do this. And so here we are. 58 books later, here we are. Thank you, guys. Does anybody else have any other questions? Yes, over here. Hang on a minute, sweetie, because this is recorded and people at home want to know all the stories about prostitutes. We need to have it recorded properly.
Well,
yes.
This is about voting. I've often wondered, what does the word suffrage come from? What is the background for suffrage movements, suffragettes? I don't know.
It was all about suffering to be able, you suffered for that right, to gain that right to vote. And that started right at the beginning. The women who first founded the movement and had their first convention in New York said, we're going to have to suffer for this. And they did. It was more than a 70-year fight. I don't even want to do anything for like a day. 70 years. That's insane, but that's how long it took. So, yes.
Have you seen the series American Primeval on Netflix?
I have, the Mountain Meadow Massacre. I have seen that, and I am familiar with that story. It's just tragic.
The woman who the story centered around, who comes from Boston out to Utah, have you?
Yes, I did, and she's featured in my doctor book because the Mormons were very progressive because they had big families, and some woman had to be the doctor in that group. And so they would select a woman who really wanted to study medicine, and that's who would go and get the medicine studied and then come back and train others. So yeah. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am. Hey, hang on a second. Carolyn's running with the, she's running with the mic.
There you go.
Hi, I was just wondering if any of your research ever found your way to the woman, Kate Hayes.
As a matter of fact, yes. I think in Entertaining Women, you'll find the story of Kate Hayes, the Irish singer, who the street is named after. Yes.
That's
Yeah.
where I live. I was just
Oh, well,
curious.
look at that.
Yeah,
You live in a very famous street. That's good. Good for you. Yeah. Maiden Lane. I mean, that's much more proper than Maiden Lane or, French Court, which is all named for the prostitutes here. So I said that with like an air of irritation with you. I mean, you have no hand in that, but just so you know. Anybody else? While she's getting it over, I will tell you that my books are for sale, and I take credit cards or cash or check. So, yes.
So there was I discovered a lady named Rosa May that was, speaking of prostitutes, was a prostitute in Bodie,
Yes.
which was the ghost town, and how she gave so much to her community and was ousted out. I was wondering if she ever had any kind of connection with Nevada County.
No connection with Nevada County, but indeed, she was a prostitute there. She was in love with a gentleman by the name of Ernest Marks, who did not love her back in that way. He was a bartender, but she worked 2 houses, one in Bodie and one in Carson City. And when I was doing research to write about her, I found these amazing letters between herself and her boyfriend there in Bodie. And I'm reading them thinking, this is so romantic. He's talking about how much he misses her and that Mr. Johnson misses her. And I thought, wow, a lot of people really were fond of her. And it wasn't until I got really into the letters that I realized Mr. Johnson was a euphemism for his private parts. So the letters became less romantic and more a little gross. So. One of the other books up here is also railroad travel, and it's The Widowed Ones. It's about the 7 officers' wives who were left widows at the last stand. We don't really know much about those women who lost their husbands there and the widow train that they had to take back to their homes.
Can you please tell us a little bit about the processes you use to do your research? How do you get all of this information?
I love primary source material. I'm also a licensed private investigator, so I love the deep dive. I have a book coming out in May about Catherine Thorne Kelly, who was married to Machine Gun Kelly, the gangster in 1930. And, he would have been happy to be a bootlegger. But she said, no, you can be more. Let's kidnap people. And so I went to Paradise, Texas, where she was from. I contacted relatives. I got that kind of material. When I wrote about the widowed ones, I have all of Libby Custer's things. The gentleman who had a museum that had all her things, he said, I don't want these, come and get them. And so I have her things, and that's what I used to write the book. I wrote a book about Big Nose Kate, Doc Holliday's gal, and I have all of her things. I dig until I get the primary sources, and I love that part of it. You guys are great. I want to not bore you anymore. I do hope that you enjoyed your time. And if you have anything else that you want to ask me, I'm here. Tip your waitresses. Thank you very much.
Well, don't run off. Thank you so much, Chris, for your incredible stories and wild, presenting to us the Wild West as it really was. Thank you.
Thank you.
And does everybody know that she also has a lot of interesting museum pieces over here for history of the...
Right, and I'll just say, we have some amazing museums in this county that a lot of people don't know about, and one of them is Mount St. Mary's, the Grass Valley History Museum. And it's really in great need of volunteers and a lot of help because they don't get the support that they need because most people think that they're part of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church has nothing to do with them. So, please visit your museums. We've got great pieces of all the different museums out there. So go by and take a look, and if you got questions about that, happy to answer.